When it comes to Grand Theft Auto 4 in the past, we've already talked about the commission, about Jimmy Pegorino's delusion, and how he convinces himself he's important enough to earn a seat at that table through the Pegarinos. We've gone over how he consistently mistakes favors for weakness and how he operates with this constant underlying fear that his actions might get back to the other families. Because if they do, it doesn't just hurt his chances, it could get him shut out entirely. Or worse, sanctioned in a war he has no chance of surviving. Now, truthfully, I don't want this video to feel like it's just retreading the same ground we covered in Jimmy Pegorino and Ray Pacino's videos. Those two already dive pretty deep into their individual mentalities and, more importantly, the dysfunctional relationship that sits at the core of their entire operation. A relationship that, when you really look at it, reinforces this idea that what they're running, of course, isn't a legitimate mob family. It's a delusional imitation of one with satirical clues of the fact that they completely understand what they're trying to imitate, yet actively do the complete opposite. But if you want that deeper breakdown of how those two think and how their dynamic actively undermines everything they're trying to build, then I definitely recommend checking those two videos out. Instead, what I want to focus on here today is something slightly different, addressing the fundamental question of why did the other legitimate mob families decide to leave Jimmy Pegorino alone? Now, at first glance, the answer for it is simple enough, and it does make sense. As you play through the game, the implication of why they decide to leave him alone is ultimately he is a joke. He's not taken seriously at all, and getting involved with him is seen as beneath the real families. He's an agitator. That's it. If you give him recognition or pay him any kind of attention, it doesn't put the fear of God in him, but rather excites him and feeds a little more into that delusion, that he actually matters and actually has real power behind him. Well, credible, that explanation is only partially true, because even if he is a joke, even if he is seen as beneath them, Pegorino and his organization don't exist in a vacuum. Throughout the game, they actively interfere with the rackets and operations of other families, most notably the Ancelottis and the Pavanos. And since the Pegarinos aren't an official recognized mob family, and of course don't have a seat on the commission, then the Pavanos, Ancelottis, or any other mob families that just decide to take out the Pegarinos are completely within the right to do so. They don't need approval from the commission because Pegorino has no political leverage. But what he does have is the police. Now, I'm not saying that in the way that you might think. I'm not saying that they worked for Jimmy or that Jimmy was some kind of rat. More so as inadvertent or accidental protection by the police can be seen by their own criminal records. His, Ray's, and Phil's criminal records indicate a strong amount of police surveillance surrounding them. And during the game, Jimmy's own house is infiltrated by the FIB, as his own doorman is discovered to be wearing a wire. And that's after his wife appears to be well aware that his house is actively being watched. But this is all an element I want you to keep in the back of your head for a second, because it means Pegorino is hot, and that could cause major problems for whoever decides to move in on him. But all the other families have been actively getting hit by people turning on them as well, chiefly among them the Pavanos. If we look into the newspaper headlines within Grand Theft Auto 4, there's a consistent pattern. Within the headlines, there's repeated fear-mongering, commenting on events throughout the game, from Roman's cab depot being burned down to the killing surrounding Eddie Lowe. And in those cases, the police are repeatedly attacked for their inability to capture the killer or even come up with a proper name for him, let alone any kind of identity, which further bleeds into the recent public backlash LCPD has been getting for police brutality against regular civilians. And then alongside that, there are reports on mob dealings and, more importantly, terrorism. There's actually quite a bit of mob activity, and even Nico's own handiworks reported in a way meant to clearly instill fear in foreigners coming to Liberty City, and the rise of gang members from other countries. To be honest, it's actually quite funny and extremely clever when you look at how these stories are realigned to fit each different news outlet's own bias. If I'm being completely honest here, in my personal opinion, this whole headlines and news reporting is an underrated feature within Grand Theft Auto 4, and it's something that is extremely missed in Grand Theft Auto 5, especially since 5 only has Weasel News. In GTA 4, you have Liberty Tree, an alternative newspaper outlet that gives us a different form of bias, which of course you can't get when you only have Weasel News or one specific news outlet having a monopoly and reporting on everything. Nonetheless, one prominent article focuses on a person by the name of Vito Dogmeat Minotti. Now, of course, we never see this man, as he's been in police custody since the 90s. But within this article, it reports how Vito Dogmeat Minotti stood before a judge at the Civic Citadel in order to give evidence on other mobsters. Minotti himself was tied to multiple murders back in the 90s and recently accepted a plea deal with the DA, allowing him to receive a new identity within witness protection and relocate to what is described as a horrible town in a desert state. The article goes on to share that his testimony would lead to multiple convictions, a massive blow, especially to the Pegarinos, as Minotti was a high-ranking senior member within the Pegorino crime family and received his nickname Dogmeat thanks to his ownership of a dog food processing plant, where he used it as a means to both launder money and dispose of bodies from mob hits. The article also shares that Minotti is not the only mobster to turn recently either, though. There's been quite a number of mobsters who've been exchanging valuable information on others in favor of a lighter sentence. The FIB is credited as the organization spearheading these arrests, further tying in their work with cracking down on the Pegarinos, as Jimmy's own doorman was again working with the FIB. A small detail here as well, kind of an easy to miss one, is a quote from the former Secretary of Security Enforcement, sharing his thoughts on the recent crackdowns and successful turning of mobsters. The quote reads, "There's always going to be organized crime. The mob in Liberty City is being weakened, but it's just opening up room for new gangsters coming to town. The Alderney-based mobsters are trying to take control of Liberty City rackets, and gangsters are coming in from Eastern Europe. These guys are even worse than the likes of Vito Dogmeat. There's a lot of money in Liberty City and officials willing to be bought off, so there will always be crooks here trying to take advantage of the situation. It's unfortunately the dark side of human nature." Within that paragraph, it hits multiple points. The Alderney-based mobsters, of course, is talking about Pegorino, mentioning how there's always going to be organized crime and that the mobsters are being weakened, is acknowledging the current state of the overall situation, but the bigger point here is turning the attention on Eastern Europe, commenting on how those guys are worse than the likes of Vito Dogmeat. That's extremely significant, because for those who've forgotten or doesn't know who that person is, making this quote, you're not at fault. It's a very small character. It's the associate of John Gravelli who Nico escorts to his meeting at City Hall, where he's set to speak against Dmitry and the Russians' increasingly aggressive efforts to take over city rackets from Gravelli's organization.
These Russian fucking bastards are trying to finish us!
What do you want me to do about it?
I want you to work with me. A good friend of mine is coming into town to give a speech on the new threat to Liberty City. Russian organized crime. I got a feeling some people ain't gonna want that speech to happen.
So publicly, this friend of Gravelli has already made a speech against organized Russian crime. And here he is either giving another speech or a direct quote to the newspaper, or even, admittedly, could be a part of the speech he gave after Nico made sure he got to City Hall safely. Of course, his friendship to Gravelli, the don of the Gambetti crime family, may be a secret kept far away from the public. But also it further complicates the rivalry between the FIB and IAA, because here is Gravelli's friend, while acknowledging the successful efforts of the FIB, steers attention away from its recent crackdowns to align more with Gravelli's interests, who's also a friend, or let's call it ally, of the IAA. I'm not saying the IAA definitely had a hand in it, I just think it's interesting how if you pay close enough attention, you can actually see and feel the footprint of both government agencies if you know where to look. For some added continuity, I also want to point out that the reporter and author behind this article is Tony J. Smith, and he follows this one up with another article titled Neighboring Hood Watch. Alderney Crime Syndicate Threatens Commission Territory, and honestly just the name and the picture alone should give us a pretty clear idea of what this whole article is about. It's about Jimmy Pegorino and his own increasing moves within Alderney. Within the article, Tony writes about a series of robberies, allegations of extortion, and several racketeering cases that have been brought against Pegorino's crime syndicate by the Alderney state government. And he acknowledges that the so-called Alderney mob is gaining more and more prominence, more and more column inches, and more attention as it continues expanding. Pegorino is described here as a so-called quote-unquote businessman, with his crime family becoming something of a new phenomenon, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of the rackets within Alderney were previously held by the 5 Liberty City families. Those being the Ancelottis, the Pegarinos, the Gambettis, the Messinas, and the Lupicias, all of whom formed the commission. But within the recent wave of state investigations into organized crime, the result has been a dramatically weakened hold of the commission, and within this vulnerability, it has opened up what the article describes as a more ruthless, cutthroat approach into criminality. It's an interesting choice of words because it does highlight the difference between Pegorino's approach and the more traditional and respectful approach that other families, or real families, would go about conducting business, especially when it comes to outsiders. Something the article even acknowledges by saying that long gone are the days of the noble gangster leaving a tip in the pocket of truck drivers they knock over. Instead, the Alderney mob is now leaving a trail of bodies in its wake. And so there's a report of a shift clearly being described here. It's not just about territory anymore, it's about the tone of the entire criminal landscape changing around Pegorino, which is partially mistaken as a sensational lie because, again, Pegorino isn't a mob family. Nonetheless, the article ends with an anonymous source saying this: "The Alderney mob is grabbing all the headlines at the moment for one reason. The commission wants them to be. They got put under the heat by people snitching and all the RICO bullshit. Now they're letting these Guidos from over the West River get a name for themselves so the feds will start investigating them instead. Simple as that. There ain't no chance of these chumps getting any real power." And that's the core of the idea. Jimmy and his organization, for them, are essentially the fall guys. One that may even be enjoying the notoriety he's finally getting through articles such as this. Pegorino is all about appearances, particularly when it came to being the big boss and being feared. And within this report, he's getting exactly that. Open recognition. Acknowledgement that he's someone to be reckoned with, as he's apparently taken over rackets within Alderney City. The catch, though, is that this also means a day in court and being placed under all this police scrutiny. But then again, is he even smart enough to realize that the families within the higher echelons have no need to worry about court dates the same way he does? Then there's an interesting angle of this anonymous source, because when you look at the language being used, it feels like more than just a random bystander talking. It comes off as someone who either has some inner knowledge of the commission's politics, or at least has enough understanding of the families and of what Pegorino is by comparison. I read it less as some innocent outsider making an observation and more like someone who either has real pull, or at the very least enough understanding of the situation to know that Pegorino is basically just being allowed to soak up all the attention while the five families lick their recent wounds and reassess themselves. I also think this article may be a little misleading in the way it's written, because it mentions how Alderney's rackets were normally run by the five families, but in-game, there really isn't much mention of any of those families actually venturing over into Alderney apart from the Pegarinos. There is a presence in Broker, Bohan, sure, but the real concentration of all the families is undoubtedly within Algonquin. The same sites that Phil even mentions is where the commission is located. So I think the article is doing a little more than just reporting facts here. It's shaping the perception of Pegorino a bit more, while also adding a little bit more intrigue here. Because again, the public doesn't properly know the full extent of all the families. Hell, we don't even know the extent of all the families. We see the Ancelottis, the Pafanos, Gravelli's the only person we see from the Gambettis, and I believe the Messinas appear in the Ballad of Gay Tony DLC. Lupacias, if memory serves right, are never actually shown, so most of the action we get end up being focused on the weaker families out of the five. But if you pull from the history of the Pegorino syndicate, Jimmy's father was running whatever they called their organization before Jimmy ever took over, and by the time Jimmy's in charge, he claims he's allowing the Pavanos to work rackets on this side of the river as a favor. A favor he later pulls by sending Nico to attack the autoerotica car dealership. So despite what the article says, it's really the Ancelottis and the Pavanos that run select and limited rackets within Alderney, probably as a means of their own expansion without stepping on the toes of the other, larger and stronger families' business. And that's pretty much why the commission allowed Pegorino to do everything he did. Within the story, we do see him pretty much bring about his own downfall. He allows Anthony to bug his house, then kills him, which adds an immense amount of suspicion back onto him for the death of Anthony, who, at that point, was in the hospital under heavy police security. Then he follows that up by killing Ray Bacino in an effort to just show he means business and maybe, in his mind, get the cops to back off. But it was all just a matter of time. At the same time, though, what I think is interesting here is that this little bit of insight is still enough to show us something extremely important. Even without us ever meeting the other families directly, and even without getting much more from Gravelli on how all of their operations work, they still clearly chose a strategy. And that strategy was to essentially lay low, let the house of cards that is Pegorino Syndicate keep propping itself up for a little while longer, until it finally knocks itself down with a lit match and gasoline, all in an effort to prove that it's a real house in the first place.